The courtroom didn't fall silent when he entered. It chuckled. Quietly at first, a few smirks exchanged among junior clerks, then a stifled laugh from someone near the back as the old man wheeled himself through the doors. His wheelchair creaked, and the uneven rhythm of its left wheel made an awkward sound that only drew more eyes. He wasn't dressed for sympathy. No lawyer beside him, no cane, no medals, just a worn and faded Air Force jacket stretched across a thin frame. Both pant legs were neatly folded and pinned up, the fabric empty where his legs used to be. His face was clean-shaven but tired, and his eyes carried the weight of years no one in that room had lived through. A bailiff whispered something under his breath, something about how people will do anything to get out of rent. The judge, an aging man himself with a silver tie clip and a reputation for impatience, cracked the beginning of a smile. That moment, that smirk, would echo. The old man didn't speak right away. He didn't fumble, didn't cry, didn't beg. He sat with his hands resting quietly on a brown leather folder in his lap. When the judge asked if he had anything to say in his defense, he simply nodded and began to open the folder with fingers that trembled only slightly. From inside, he took a single object, a photograph, worn thin at the edges, yellowed with time. He held it gently, like something sacred. Then he placed it face up on the table without a word. The room didn't gasp, not yet, but the judge's face shifted. Not in shock, not at first. It was slower than that, a flicker of something like confusion, then recognition. Then the color in his cheeks seemed to vanish. His hand twitched slightly just once. No one else in the courtroom understood what had just happened, but something had changed. The judge's mouth opened, but no words came. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph, and suddenly the posture, the distance, the detachment, all of it collapsed into a moment that no one else could fully grasp. Because only two people in that room remembered what happened on November 3rd, 1972, in a desert far from home. One of them had scars on his body. The other carried them in his silence. And now, for the first time in 50 years, they had returned to the same place. Not a battlefield, a courtroom. But the war wasn't over. The morning session at Montgomery County Courthouse had already run 20 minutes behind schedule when the bailiff called the next case. The judge, Raymond Ellison, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and clipped tone, adjusted his glasses and glanced at the docket. Another eviction hearing? Another tenant unable to pay? He exhaled sharply and signaled for the next defendant. The doors creaked open, and the room fell into an awkward pause as an elderly man in a wheelchair entered. He moved slowly, the wheels grinding faintly against the linoleum floor, his figure thin, wrapped in a weathered military jacket that had clearly once been blue but now carried the faded patina of time. The fabric on both legs had been neatly folded and pinned, revealing that the man had no legs. A few murmurs passed between the interns near the back. One clerk covered a smile with her hand, while another leaned in to whisper something about another fake vet trying to play the sympathy card. The judge looked up briefly from his paperwork, noticed the wheelchair, and let out an almost imperceptible sigh. The man made his way to the defense table with effort and without help. No one offered to assist him. He carried no briefcase, no stack of organized legal documents. Just a worn leather folder rested on his lap. He set it gently on the table as he positioned himself with a subtle push of his right wheel. His name was Franklin H. Miller. The court knew little about him other than the basics: late on rent, violation of building code, disturbance complaints. To most people in the room, he looked like a relic who had wandered into the wrong era, a man whose time had passed and whose usefulness had long expired. The prosecutor, a young man in a tight suit with flawless posture, stood to present the case. His voice was calm, confident, laced with performative concern. He listed the infractions one by one: missed rent payments, failure to maintain a clean living space, complaints from neighbors about noise, reports of shouting. He emphasized the cost to the building and the burden on city resources. He spoke about policies and ordinances and offered polite, impersonal disdain for those who refused to comply with basic standards. While he spoke, Frank Miller sat in silence, hands resting over the folder, eyes fixed on the judge. His face didn't change, didn't twitch, didn't react. He didn't argue or interrupt. His stillness was almost unsettling in a room full of motion and chatter. Judge Ellison drummed his fingers on the bench. The tone of the room was already sealed. This was a routine case, one of many that day, and the man in the wheelchair had done little to disrupt that rhythm. He hadn't brought legal counsel. He hadn't asked for leniency. He hadn't even made a scene. To the judge, that signaled resignation, not dignity. He viewed the silence as a waste of time. He glanced at the clock and asked the defendant if he had anything to say in his own defense. The question hung in the air like a challenge, laced with something close to irritation. The courtroom was full of impatience. No one had time for a slow answer. Frank raised his head slowly, met the judge's eyes, and gave a single nod before opening the folder on his lap. The moment passed. Without fanfare, no one gasped, no one clapped. But in that pause, barely noticed by most, a line was about to be crossed, one that would change the tone of the room, the rhythm of the court, and the weight of a man's history that had been carried too long in silence. The people who watched from their benches saw only a man too old to fight back. They didn't yet know the war he'd already survived. Frank had grown used to silence, not the peaceful kind that settles over a quiet morning, but the heavy, slow kind that follows a life retreating from the world. It wasn't always like this. Once he had been a voice of command, a presence in the room, someone whose words carried weight. In another life, he gave orders that saved lives or ended them. Now he lived in a crumbling third-floor apartment at the edge of the city, where the elevator worked only on good days and the heating rattled louder than it warmed. Most of his neighbors didn't know his name. Some referred to him simply as the old guy in the chair. Others complained when his windows were open and they heard recordings of military marches or late-night news playing at too high a volume, unaware or unconcerned that he couldn't sleep without noise. The quiet brought the worst memories. The VA check covered just enough to keep the lights on. After his service, he had tried a dozen different jobs: security guard, bus driver, hardware clerk, but the legs had gone before retirement could soften anything. Infection turned into amputation. Surgery turned into withdrawal. Eventually, life narrowed to the apartment, the grocery store, the pharmacy, and the long hours in between. Martha had been the last light in the darkness. She died 8 years ago, quietly, at home, the way she wanted. After that, Frank stopped talking to most people. It was easier that way. he had outlived most of the ones who mattered. Those who were still alive had long since moved to other states, other lives, lives that didn't involve ramps and prosthetics and government letters full of bureaucratic sympathy. His medals stayed in a drawer. The uniform hung in the back of the closet, barely touched, save for the jacket he wore now and then when he needed something that reminded him he used to be more than just a file number. On Veterans Day, sometimes strangers would offer him a handshake outside the pharmacy or nod in passing, and Frank would smile out of habit, not out of feeling. He'd grown suspicious of temporary gratitude, the kind that vanished as soon as the gesture was made. There were times he wondered if it would have been better to go down with the others, to be remembered in a folded flag and a framed photo, rather than fade away behind peeling drywall and the sound of a leaky faucet. In the court records, his case was labeled as a low-priority nuisance, a generic complaint buried among dozens like it. But to Frank, the eviction was more than just a legal proceeding. It was erasure, another piece of his identity being boxed up and removed. They said the complaints were about noise and cleanliness. They didn't mention the time he'd called 911 when his neighbor had a stroke, or how he used to fix the building's mailbox when no one else did. They didn't care that the dog he'd lived with for 10 years, his PIESD companion, had been gone for months now, and that sometimes he left the door open out of habit, expecting to hear claws on the linoleum floor. They didn't care because they didn't see it, and Frank didn't tell them. He never did. That was the problem. He never explained. He never asked. He just endured. So now he sat in that courtroom, surrounded by strangers who didn't know his name, who didn't know his story, who looked at him and saw a burden on the system. They didn't know the weight of the photographs in his folder. They didn't know the names of the men buried in Arlington that he whispered to before bed. They didn't know that beneath the silence was a man holding on to the last thread of his dignity. And in that isolation, in that space where the world forgets you ever mattered, Frank prepared to speak, not because he wanted to, but because no one else would. Outside, the day moved on. Cars passed the courthouse. Horns echoed faintly through open windows, and life continued uninterrupted by the quiet unraveling happening within courtroom 4B. Inside, time felt slower, heavier. Frank remained still behind the defendant's table, his folded legs tucked beneath the wheelchair, hands resting lightly on the worn leather folder across his lap. The judge had already begun mentally closing the file. His tone had turned sharper, less patient. He asked direct questions, expecting short, dismissive answers. The prosecutor, emboldened by the apparent weakness of the defense, pressed forward confidently, laying out procedural points with a practiced rhythm. The small audience that sat in the gallery barely paid attention anymore, distracted by phones or quietly chatting over the next case. To them, it was just another formality, a routine eviction of another old man too stubborn to leave quietly. But in the very back of the courtroom, unnoticed by most, a woman sat forward in her chair. Her name was Lisa Crawford, a court administrator, filling in temporarily due to staff shortages. She had seen hundreds of hearings just like this one, usually without looking up more than a few times. But something about the veteran's stillness made her pause. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't confusion. It was something else, something deliberate. She narrowed her eyes and tilted her head slightly, watching the way his hand hovered over the edge of the folder like it held more than just paperwork. She recognized the kind of posture that came from discipline, not fragility. And when he finally opened the folder and carefully removed a single photograph, her eyes fixed on the motion. The image was small, black and white, worn down at the corners like it had been handled 1,000 times. From her distance, she couldn't make out the details, but the way the judge stopped mid-sentence was enough to send a ripple of awareness through the room. It happened so subtly that most people missed it. The judge, who just a moment earlier had been skimming through case notes with casual detachment, had frozen. His hand rested above the desk, eyes locked on the photo like he'd seen a ghost. A few seconds passed, and the room adjusted to a silence no longer born of indifference, but of attention. Lisa watched the judge's expression change, not drastically, not dramatically, but piece by piece. His brows lowered slightly, his mouth, previously tight with bureaucratic tension, softened. The paper in his hand slowly lowered until it rested flat on the bench. Frank didn't say a word. He didn't look around for impact or speak to fill the space. He simply set the photo in front of him, then closed the folder again with quiet finality, as if he had laid a card on the table and was waiting for it to be seen. One of the junior clerks in the corner finally looked up from her phone, sensing the mood shift. Another paused their typing, glancing at the judge. Something unspoken was happening, something unlisted on the docket and outside the structure of the hearing. A memory had been triggered, one buried under decades of suits and gavels and decisions handed down without consequence. The judge didn't move, but something in his eyes flickered, a kind of tremor that no one else would notice unless they knew what to look for. And Lisa did. She slowly stood and walked out of the courtroom without a word. No one noticed her leave. In the hallway, she pulled out her phone and made a call. Not to legal support, not to housing services, but to someone whose name was still listed in an old contact list from her days working with military archives. As the phone rang, she glanced through the small window in the door and saw Frank sitting exactly as he had been, silent and still, like a statue placed at the center of something everyone else was only beginning to understand. Inside, the judge cleared his throat, but it sounded less sure than before. The prosecutor, confused by the hesitation, leaned in as if to speak again, but stopped himself when he saw the judge's gaze still fixed on the photograph. Frank didn't speak. He didn't need to. The first crack had formed, the weight of the room had shifted, and the turning point, slow as it was, had begun to roll forward. The courthouse clock ticked steadily toward the top of the hour, but time inside courtroom 4B had taken on a different weight. Something intangible had settled into the space, replacing the casual routine of minor hearings and low-stakes legal motions with a growing sense of tension that most in the room couldn't quite define. The judge remained seated, but his posture had changed. The assertive lean forward had softened, his hands resting still on the desk. The photo that Frank had placed now quietly commanding his attention. He hadn't asked any follow-up questions. He hadn't moved to dismiss the case. He hadn't even looked back down at his notes. He was staring at a piece of his own past that had returned without warning. No one spoke. The prosecutor, who just minutes earlier had confidently recited lease violations and policy infractions, sat rigid in his chair, waiting for the signal to proceed. But none came. The small gallery of observers, law students, clerks, one or two local reporters who had been there for unrelated stories, had fallen into a kind of polite confusion. They could sense that something had shifted, but they didn't have the context to understand why the air had grown so dense. The silence held. Frank didn't move. His chair made no sound. His hands remained on his lap, fingers interlaced loosely, his eyes now not on the judge, but on the far wall, distant, calm. The moment that had passed between him and Judge Ellison was theirs alone, not spoken, not explained. It lived in the space between memory and presence, between obligation and debt. No one else needed to understand it. Frank had done what he came to do. He had said the truth without raising his voice, without presenting arguments, without appealing to sympathy. He had simply reminded a man of who he had been, and who had been there when it mattered most. Outside the building, the sound of tires crunching on gravel announced the arrival of something unexpected. A matte black SUV, unmarked but unmistakable in its posture and presence, pulled into the private lot behind the courthouse. Its engine idled low, a second vehicle pulling in behind it. No sirens, no fanfare, just precise, deliberate movement. The first to step out was a man in uniform, still fit despite the years, ribbons aligned across his chest. The second was a woman, dressed in civilian clothing, but carrying the bearing of rank. Both made their way toward the side entrance, saying nothing. Back inside, the courtroom door opened without ceremony. The bailiff turned to address the interruption, but stopped mid-motion when he recognized the visitors. The uniformed man walked with purpose, each step echoing slightly against the polished floor. He approached the bench, not hesitantly but respectfully, and handed a sealed envelope directly to the judge. No words were exchanged. Judge Ellison accepted the document, his hand slightly trembling as he broke the seal and read its contents. The courtroom remained quiet, but the tension had evolved. This was no longer the silence of routine or boredom. It was the silence of reckoning. The judge read the letter twice. Then slowly, carefully, he placed it beside the photo on his desk and looked up, first at Frank, then at the prosecutor, then at the gallery. Something had settled in his eyes. Not panic, not guilt. Something deeper, recognition, and a quiet shame that came only when the weight of memory outgrew the comfort of indifference. Frank didn't smile. He didn't show satisfaction. His face remained unchanged, weathered and still, like the surface of a monument. The arrival of those who once served with him had not surprised him. He hadn't called for them. He hadn't needed to. Some debts are repaid not out of duty, but out of something older, something formed in fire and dust and silence. Some bonds never rust. The judge finally spoke, but his voice was lower than before, absent the clipped edge of bureaucracy. The words were not yet a decision, but they carried with them the weight of one. Everyone in the room leaned forward slightly, sensing that the case had crossed into territory none of them had anticipated. Frank didn't respond. He didn't need to. In the most powerful moment of the hearing, he said nothing at all. And in that silence, everything changed. The silence inside courtroom 4B no longer felt like hesitation. It felt like gravity. Everyone present had registered the shift, even if they couldn't name its source. Something larger than the eviction hearing had taken hold, and it anchored the room in a quiet that demanded reverence. Judge Ellison remained seated, the unopened folder and the photograph lying side by side in front of him. The letter that had been delivered minutes earlier rested between them like a final piece of evidence too heavy for words. He hadn't turned the page. He didn't need to. Whatever it contained had already taken root behind his eyes, in the faint sag of his shoulders and the rigid stillness of his hands. Across the courtroom, the prosecutor sat motionless, his earlier momentum now fully collapsed. He was young, capable, but unprepared for what had unfolded. The strength of procedural argument had no bearing here anymore. Legal precedent did not account for what happens when memory crashes through institutional detachment. He glanced nervously toward the bench, waiting for direction, for an order, for anything that might signal how to proceed, but none came. Frank sat as he had for the past hour, unmoved, unmoving. The discipline in his stillness said more than 100 testimonies. He didn't gloat. He didn't tremble. He waited, not for revenge, but for honesty. He wasn't asking for anyone to kneel or apologize. He wasn't asking for anything. That was what made the moment so difficult to contain, because the weight wasn't his. It belonged to the others now. The judge cleared his throat, not to begin, but to steady himself. When he finally stood, the motion was slow and deliberate. The robe shifted over his shoulders as if burdened by something it no longer protected him from. He didn't look at Frank at first. He looked out over the courtroom, at the clerks, at the interns, at the reporters who now sat upright, pins motionless. Then his gaze returned to the man at the wheelchair, this man who had entered quietly, said almost nothing, and held up a mirror to a life the judge had tried to bury beneath decades of routine. With no dramatic pause, no speech, he walked down from the bench and approached the defendant's table. The gesture alone changed everything. Judges do not descend for formality. They do not close the distance unless something unspoken has demanded it. When he reached Frank's side, he stood in silence, his expression difficult to read. For a moment, the entire room held its breath. Then, in one small act that no one expected, he placed his hand over the photograph, not to remove it, not to claim it, but to anchor himself. The tension that had hung in the air softened, and still no one spoke. He turned back toward the gallery and addressed the room. His voice, when it came, was steady, but different, less authoritative, more human. He didn't read from the docket. He didn't reference the code or the complaint. He simply stated the truth, that this man, Franklin H. Miller, had served not just the country, but the very people in the courtroom without their knowledge, that the system had failed to see him, that he himself had failed to remember him, that this hearing had begun as a formality and become a reckoning. He dismissed the case without hesitation, not only the eviction, but the record of it. He called for a stay on any further legal action related to the property, and he ordered that the Housing Board review Miller's service and disability status immediately for permanent assistance. The prosecutor said nothing. He could only nod, stunned into humility. And from the gallery came a murmur, not of shock, but of recognition. One by one, people began to stand, not because they were told to, not because a verdict had been read, but because something sacred had passed through the room, and instinct told them to rise. No one applauded. There were no cheers. Only silence again, but not the same kind of silence. This one carried weight, respect, acknowledgement. The kind reserved for moments that history doesn't always record, but the heart never forgets. Frank remained seated, his face unchanged, but his eyes had shifted just slightly. For the first time all morning, they softened. The judge remained beside him, no longer a figure of authority, but a man among equals. His voice lowered again, this time not for the room, but for Frank alone. No words were heard, but the meaning passed clearly between them. Not absolution, not forgiveness, just memory returned to its rightful place. Outside, the sky had shifted to that late afternoon gold, the kind that turns the edges of buildings soft and makes every shadow seem deeper. The courthouse steps sat quiet as people trickled out in small groups, whispering not with gossip, but with the weight of something unshakable. No cameras had arrived, no news vans lined the curb. The moment that had just occurred inside courtroom 4B would not make headlines, but it would linger in the memory of every person who had been there. Frank remained inside a little longer. He didn't rush to leave. He had moved through the world long enough to know when something needed time to settle. The judge had returned to chambers without ceremony, carrying the photograph with him, not as evidence, but as something more personal, a reminder, a burden, or perhaps something resembling peace. When Frank finally exited the courtroom, the hallway was mostly empty. His wheelchair rolled slowly, each rotation of the wheels deliberate, not with weakness, but with a kind of grace that no one teaches and few understand. He exited through the side entrance, where the concrete ramp met the parking lot with a smooth curve. The sunlight hit his face, and for the first time in hours he blinked as though wakened from a long, silent march. At the curb, the same matte black SUV still waited. The man in uniform who had delivered the envelope earlier now stood beside it, hands behind his back, posture straight. He said nothing as Frank approached. He didn't salute. He simply stepped aside and opened the rear door. Inside, folded precisely on the seat, was a clean pressed uniform jacket identical to the one Frank wore, except this one bore a recent commendation pin across the chest, its gold edge catching the light. Frank looked at it for a long moment before reaching in, not to wear it, but to lay his hand gently across it. The silence between the two men spoke more clearly than words ever could. The officer nodded once, a quiet gesture of understanding, and closed the door again. Frank turned away from the vehicle and wheeled himself to the far end of the lot, where a line of trees cast long shadows across the pavement. A bench sat beneath one of them, weathered, splintered, forgotten. He parked beside it, resting in the shade. The courthouse loomed behind him, tall and distant. From this angle, it looked less like an institution and more like a relic of something trying to remember its own purpose. A breeze moved softly through the branches above, stirring the dust on the sidewalk and carrying with it the low hum of distant traffic. Frank sat in silence, not out of sadness, not even out of reflection, but out of something simpler. A pause, a moment to let the noise of the world recede and allow the truth of the day to settle in its rightful place. He had not won anything. He had not claimed victory. But dignity had returned to the room that had nearly stripped it from him. And that, for a man like Frank, was enough. Far across the lot, one of the courthouse clerks paused before entering her car. She looked back once, watching the figure in the wheelchair beneath the tree. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. But she stood there for a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to memorize the shape of a man history had tried to forget and failed. Then she opened the door and drove away, leaving behind only the hush of wind and the long shadow of a man who had waited a lifetime to be seen.